We'll go ahead and get started here. Just have very brief announcements, so that'll give folks about another minute to join. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the July 2020 GF Ideas Business Seminar Series, the Business of Alt Protein. We are very lucky and excited to be joined by Jordan Kanis from Silicon Valley Bank today to talk to us and answer questions about debt financing for your alternative protein business. Should be really great content, and we're excited to hear that. As a reminder, this is a monthly webinar on the business side of running an alternative protein company and is open to all those who are interested in commercial aspects of alternative proteins. So we're joined today by lots of entrepreneurs, investors, subject matter experts, consultants, students, scientists, and others who comprise this unique global community of alternative proteins innovation that is housed in GF Ideas. Most of you are already GF Ideas members, but if you would like to join and learn more about GF Ideas, you can visit our new community landing page, actually, which is at gfi.org/community, and you can learn about our upcoming webinars, what it means to be in GF Ideas, a link to join, and other good stuff like that. And I guess as my final announcement before we dive into the presentation is that this will be my last time making announcements on this call. This call was kind of a modified from the legacy GF Ideas call where we used to have an open table discussion and things like that. We've really grown a lot as a community and think that the best use of time is really focusing on the presenter and moving the open table discussion and sharing resources into other channels. So the Slack is a great way to share resources. And also are excited to announce that we are launching a GF Ideas newsletter, which should go out for the first time in late July. And that's from now on where we will make announcements like our upcoming webinars. We'll also share industry news, scientific updates. We'll highlight a member of GF Ideas and other good stuff like that. So look for those kinds of communications from now on in the GFI newsletter. And like I mentioned, if you go to gfi.org/community, you can make sure that you're signed up for the GF Ideas community to receive those kinds of communications. And if you are in GF Ideas, you should have received an email that had a link to opt into that newsletter, as well as to update your information in the GF Ideas directory. So you should be good to go there. Last announcement is please, at all times when you're in the GF Ideas community, abide by the antitrust laws. We certainly wouldn't want to break those. And yeah, that's it. I will dive into introducing our presenter, Jordan Kanis from Silicon Valley Bank, who will present for approximately 30 to 35 minutes, which should leave us about 20 minutes or more for a very robust Q&A. Please do use the Q&A feature through the Zoom feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen, say Q&A. And I will hold those questions until the end, and I will moderate the Q&A discussion at the end with Jordan. But feel free to start putting those in at any time. Yeah, and I guess that's administratively. In terms of what we're going to cover today, it's really about how the alternative protein industry can unlock the different types of debt financing in order to scale up their operations, which is going to be incredibly important as this industry evolves from one that's more nascent to one that's more mainstream and becomes, hopefully in the short to medium and long future is the way that we produce most of our meat, eggs, and dairy. And so yeah, we'll talk about the types of financing. We'll talk about their benefits and drawbacks, as well as how to unlock that kind of financing and what folks like Jordan look for in companies, and in a variety of other topics as we go along. And Jordan is the Director of Energy and Resource Innovation at Silicon Valley Bank, which you're probably all familiar with. It's one of the leading banks that work with technology companies. He's got decades of experience working with companies kind of in the clean tech sector. So anyone that's going to move the needle for climate change is the area that he works. He also has experience in domestic and international financing, cash and treasury management solutions, and lending to early growth and later stage clean tech companies. Silicon Valley Bank is great because they work with companies at all stages, not just later stage companies. So I will allow Jordan to provide a further introduction to what he does and what the bank does, and let him share his screen and dive into the presentation.
Sure, great. Thanks so much, Nate. Really happy to be here to talk to the GFI community today about two of my favorite subjects, bank debt and alternative protein. Just to follow up a little bit on what Nate said, actually not decades of experience in clean tech, decades of experience overall, but I was a cash flow lender for many years and have been with Silicon Valley Bank for coming up on 9 years now. So working with entrepreneurial space, and has been very exciting. As a matter of background in alternative protein, I actually first got introduced to it back in 2012 when I was on a call with Samir Kaul from Coastal Ventures, and we were talking about a different company. And at the end of the conversation, he mentioned, I have this other company, which was called Jasper Ridge Creamery at the time. And they're doing this interesting thing where they're going to use plants to make a product that looks and tastes exactly like meat. And he said, I know it sounds crazy. And I kind of nodded, that does sound crazy. But it's something we're really excited about, and high risk, high reward. And so, 8 or 9 years later, they've really made some great progress. And actually not long after that conversation, I got introduced to the team at Beyond Meat as well. So, those are two great success stories, obviously. But as Nate said, we work with companies at all stages, companies that are rolling out of universities with IP, companies that are in accelerators and incubators, working on their technology development, and from there. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we can start on a few slides. And let me give you apologies if there's a little bit of background noise. I'm outside on a deck here in Lake Tahoe. Didn't plan my vacation very perfectly with my wife, and so I'm doing this from outside here. But hold on one second. So sharing my screen, and
Yeah, Jordan, thanks for sharing your Tahoe time with us. We can live vicariously through the trees we can see in the reflection here. If we're lucky, we'll get to hear some birds chirping, perhaps.
Oops, I'm trying to get my presenter view. It's not giving me presenter view. Show presenter view. Okay. I got to back up one slide. So as Nate said, today we'll talk about a few topics. First, a little bit about the bank. I'm not sure that you all know much about Silicon Valley Bank. And then on to what various flavors of debt, why a company should consider or take on debt, and then what some of the driving factors are to securing debt. The caveat here is that Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, works in a large part with companies that are still burning cash, right? So they're not generating positive cash flow, and that's one of the unique things about the bank and venture debt is being able to provide incremental capital to companies that aren't cash flow positive. It's pretty unique in the banking industry. There are several banks along with SVB, but really only a handful out of quite a few banks that just can't possibly lend money to these businesses. So it's very interesting. But because of that, what I'm going to talk about today is really through the lens of the bank and how we look at debt, which is primarily with cash burning businesses. Okay, so Silicon Valley Bank's been around for almost 40 years now, have been a strong financial partner to the technology industry and innovation economy. So,
Hey, Jordan, I'm having an audio issue. I'm not sure if others are getting that as well.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just get a little closer. So headquartered in Santa Clara, California. We've got offices throughout the US, as you can see on this map, and 12 international offices, including London was kind of our first. We're also in Dublin, Ireland. Within the last 2 years, we opened in Frankfurt and Copenhagen. If you kind of move further east, we're in Tel Aviv, where there's a big entrepreneurial community and a lot of alternative protein companies, as you probably know. We're also in Bangalore, India. We have a joint venture with Shanghai Pudong Bank in China. So we have 3 offices there. We've been in China for almost 10 years as well. And then in North America, we have a Toronto office as well. What do we do? Commercial banking. So we provide, deposit services. We provide debt, of course, trade finance, foreign exchange, commercial card services, really the bread and butter of commercial banking. On the investment side, many of our companies raise money and they raise 18 to 24 months of cash. So often they can put some of that cash into, income generating investments through our SVB asset management team. Right now rates are obviously very low, but we look at, treasuries and agencies and high grade commercial paper, really try to preservation of principal is paramount to all investors. So that's really how we look at the investment solutions. On the research and insight side, we provide general market analyses. We work pretty closely with corporate VCs and we provide research and analytics for them and others. And then we put a fair amount of content onto social media in many different aspects of what we do and in the life stages that we work with. On the funds management side, we provide banking to venture capital companies and private equity firms. So we do fund banking. We provide debt to those companies as well. We also have SVB Capital, where we actually manage some funds for some select LPs, investing primarily in fund of funds with some later stage direct investments. On the private bank side, we provide services to our founders and executive team, and also our VC and private equity partners for personal private banking and wealth management. And then on the investment banking side, we recently purchased within the last couple of years a small investment bank out of the East Coast. So we're primarily a commercial bank, but now we're starting to do work in the equity capital markets. Pretty much life science focused at this point, but it's going to start moving over into our area as well. So really expanding the breadth of what we can do at the bank. Going down financial highlights, we 75 billion in assets. That puts us, we're about the 42nd-ish largest bank in the US. So we're not a $3 trillion JP Morgan, but we're certainly, we've got a strong balance sheet and the ability to do quite a lot of things. A lot of growth over the last few years, of course. Just a second, quick slide here. What this, the specific sectors that we work in, hardware and frontier tech. So for a long time, we were really aligned with the semiconductor industry. Of course, that's tempered a bit here in the US over time. Right now on the hardware side, we do a lot with robotics. And rocketry, for example, and drones. So a lot of interesting stuff in the hardware space. But software really drives, sails our boat. That makes up a large part of our portfolio and our lending portfolio. And that's, enterprise applications, consumer internet, fintech is very big. Some exciting companies in that space. Life sciences is also very strong. We work medical devices, pharmaceutical development, and the general digitization of healthcare. The next is energy and resource innovation, which is my group, formerly known as Clean Tech. So, broadly, we work in renewable energy and storage is a big part of it. Vehicle electrification and over the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of food and ag tech. And then on the private equity side, as I mentioned, we do the fund banking for VCs and private equity firms. And then we've got a small, well, it's not small anymore, premium wine business. So early on, some of our entrepreneurs that had great outcomes here in the Bay Area looked sort of north to Sonoma and Napa for, places to invest the money that they'd made, and started up some wineries or bought wineries. And over time, that's really developed into a nice premium wine group. We bank 300 wineries in total in Napa, Sonoma, in Central California coast, and also Oregon and Washington. So a little bit of an add-on to what we do at our core, but it's kind of a fun business, and we can bring that into some of the conversations and events that we do. And then broadly, going down to the bottom left, we bank a lot of the venture-backed companies in the U.S. I mean, we're really known as the biggest VC supporting bank. There's others out there, but we definitely are the major player here. As you can see, 69% of the IPOs in 2019 were companies that we backed, including the biggest and best IPO of last year, our friends at Beyond Meat. Loan portfolio. This is a little misleading. This is total loan out. So we bank a lot of startups, and we really like working with companies out the gate. But the lending to them is not for everyone, and it's also pretty granular compared to sort of the larger tickets we do for the larger companies. So while only 5% of the loan portfolio we do a lot of early stage lending. And then you can just see the rest there. Okay, so let's talk about debt. As Nate mentioned, we wanted to kind of look at a case study perhaps to work its way through this discussion. As an industry overall, alternative protein still is pretty early on, right? There have not been a lot of exits. And so I think I wanted to maybe just talk about a hypothetical perhaps, and that would be a company in the fermented space, perhaps one that's found a way to synthesize pea protein, perhaps, and wants to bring that to market. And maybe backing up a little bit, what I failed to mention is, in the alternative protein space, broadly, we're working with companies in plant-based, in fermented, and in cell-based. And so this company is a fermented protein company, and we'll see how well I can work that in here. So the first type of debt, and one that we'll take a few minutes on, is venture debt. And clearly this is something that's important to many early stage companies, and they come to the bank requesting this. And generally what venture debt is, it's uncovenanted general purpose debt that is backed by a senior lien on all assets of the company, which sometimes includes intellectual property, but sometimes not. The other sort of main feature of a venture debt facility is there is a warrant, right? So a right for the bank to participate in the upside in regards to equity. So venture debt is underwritten, to the company in a large part, so to the technology itself and the innovation there, and certainly the management team is very important. We, as a bank, like to see repeat entrepreneurs in new companies. That probably isn't the case so much in plant-based or in alternative protein, but we want to see a strong technical background and a nice, well-rounded team, including some financial wherewithal, right? And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And part of that is really a relatively clear go-to-market strategy. So it's got to be an interesting, differentiated technology that there's an opportunity to get to market and turn this into a company that can grow quickly. And again, that's a Silicon Valley bank way of looking at it, there's certainly plenty of companies that don't need to grow quickly, and you can grow organically. But in order to sort of tap into venture debt, we're looking for high growth opportunities. We underwrite to the companies, but because this is early stage, pre-revenue or pre-cash flow positive lending, we rely on a big part on the investors and the support behind the company. And so often venture debt will come into play once a company raises a Series A round, for example, and they'll have the ability to layer on some non-dilutive, complementary debt on top of a Series A, kind of in a 25 to 30% incremental amount. So if you raise $10 million, for example, a typical commercial facility would be maybe in the $3 million range, with an interest-only period, 12-month interest-only period, for example, and then a 30 to 36-month amortization period. Those tend to be prime-based facilities. They can sort of be in the prime to 2, 3, 4%, depending on the risk profile. There's a small warrant, as I said, that comes along with those, sort of in the less than 1% range, maybe 40 or 50 basis point range, depending on the size and the value of the company. That's sort of the main features, and I can talk more about that later if people have questions. But how does the bank look at a venture debt facility as far as repayment? Because that's our primary interest, is getting repaid. We're not taking equity level risk. We're not really going to benefit from the upside of equity, a little bit with the warrant, but at the same time, we don't want to have an all or nothing scenario. We're not in the business of losing money. So how are we going to get repaid? Well, probably by the Series B for early stage companies, right? And so because of that, we spend a lot of time talking to the investors and trying to get comfortable with the investor set. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Sometimes we can go a little bit bigger than I said, and tranche to milestones, right? So if you want to maybe get 4 or 5, it may be a milestone on some sort of revenue or some sort of really defining inflection point, like FDA approval, for example, sometimes can be a good one. As I said, that may or may not have a lien on IP. Silicon Valley Bank is not the only bank that does this. There's a few others, but there's definitely venture debt funds that do this as well. They can often write bigger checks, and they tend to be more expensive. And so we compete as often with the venture debt funds as we do with other banks, but that's another source of venture debt capital. And then another one that you see sometimes is crowdfunding. Frankly, that's venture debt, right? So you do a Kickstarter campaign or Indiegogo or Circle Up. That's another way to access funds in the early stage. Moving on, I guess, to covenanted term debt. So as you get a little bit bigger or in later rounds, you can refinance your.
Hey, Jordan, your audio. Oh, your audio is super garbled.
Is this better?
Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening. Sorry.
Can you hear me reasonably well or not?
Yes. Yeah, it's just like, some mic issue, I think. You're good. I'll stop you if any problem comes up.
Okay. I'll just stay closer to the microphone.
Sorry.
No worries. Sorry, everybody. So covenanted term debt is a way to access additional capital usually on later stage rounds, and as the company is approaching or into revenue. And so banks can get a little bit bigger on the amount that they provide, still to cash burning companies, but using a covenant as a structure. And so that can be a balance sheet covenant like a quick ratio or some type, or a current ratio in some instances, or performance covenant like a top line revenue covenant, or a gross profit covenant, or maybe an EBITDA or a max loss covenant. And and performance covenants are important because they are useful because they show, as companies are growing, and it shows that they will be able to attract additional capital because, even at that stage, this company is going to need to bring in more equity typically. And so again, we spend a lot of time focused on the investors, but with covenanted term debt, we can rely more on the operations and the performance of the company itself. And then working capital, moving on to working capital, these are, AR-based typical types of facilities that any bank could provide to a cash flow positive company. But again, if you're still burning cash, that's going to be tough to do. But for us, we would be able to do so again with the investor support, but really looking at the AR itself and advancing against AR, or in some and to a lesser extent inventory, and perhaps even purchase orders, though less so that way. The bank does a lot of recurring revenue lending as well, which is working capital, but you just don't see a lot of that sort of in the food space, right? These are more product sales than any sort of recurring revenue, contractual cash flows. When we're doing working capital, we definitely focus on the counterparties, the debtors, who's going to be paying you. In the protein space, that can be, direct to, through food distribution, through through the UNFI or the KeyHe's, or direct to, Whole Foods or to Target. Those are all great debtors. But if you're selling a sort of mom and pop stores or smaller restaurants on the food distribution side, that's a little harder to sort of structure around. But there's generally a way to get things done. We like working capital because it shows obviously that the company is out selling product in the market and doing, growing the business. Mezzanine debt, we don't see so much in alternative protein right now because it's really for companies that are growing quickly, high performing. You see that sometimes, but these are for later stage, high growth companies that are kind of nearing an exit event, nearing an IPO or an M&A. They may need a little bit more capital to push them over the line. They don't want to bring in more equity. Equity is very expensive. So the bank can provide mezzanine debt, which is often a junior lien position to senior debt. So companies at that point are going to have a senior facility. They want to bring in more capital. We can do a junior facility. It's more expensive, but it's often interest only with a bullet at the end of a 2-year term, for example. Project finance is something that we don't see much in the food space at this point. Project finance tends to be a larger ticket size, sort of in the $20 to $25 million range to start. It's an expensive transaction. It's used primarily right now in renewables, big solar facilities, C&I and utility scale. But we're seeing it a little bit into biomass. Certainly wind is a big one. The challenge there for project finance is that you need a long-term committed contract, right? So you need a 10-year contract or a 20-year contract to, in the case of solar, to pay for the solar energy that's being produced, and with that certainty of cash flow, we're able to structure a debt facility, bring that forward into sort of a net present value. But we need a strong contract. We need investment grade or similar counterparties, which in the food space there certainly are there, but they aren't willing to commit, right, to offtake for any amount of time. Sometimes we see it for a year or two, but to get a distributor or a manufacturer, a food manufacturer, to take your product at a certain price for any given length of time is just hard to do right now. So project finance typically is not available in this space. It's a little bit different than plant finance, which I think what Nate had mentioned and what many companies are interested as they kind of get to pilot and small commercial scale. Plant finance is again, unless there's committed offtake to the production of that facility, it's going to be hard to really finance that in a meaningful way. But there are some alternatives, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then other things that are available, well, not related to alternative protein. We do capital call lines, sponsor-led buyouts, that sort of thing. Go on to the next slide. So why debt? Okay, so the primary reason that companies take debt is that it's non-dilutive capital, right? It's just not as expensive as equity. If your company's going to grow over time, it could grow quickly, and every equity dollar could be worth, multiples of that. Debt usually, you're talking about 7 or 8% maybe from a commercial bank, and maybe 12 or 15% from a venture debt fund. So significantly less expensive and non-dilutive compared to equity. Why? What are the uses? Well, runway extension is the classic one for early stage companies, right? You've raised some money. You want to get to the next round. You want to hit triggering points or milestones that will increase your enterprise value prior to raising the next round, so it will not be as dilutive. And so, as I mentioned, as you raise the first round, you can extend runway from, say, 18 months of equity to another 5 or 6 months of debt on top of that, which will give you more time to, achieve your technical milestones, or, for example, solidify a commercial agreement or hit regulatory milestones. That's really the runway extension piece. It can also be used for debt used for equipment finance. So, for lab equipment, for our company, for our fermentation company, for incubators, for centrifuges or prep tanks. It can be used for, building a demo or a pilot line. So you can use it for extruders or bioreactors or spray dryers, bigger ticket items. And the way that we look at equipment finance is not significantly different than our venture debt or growth capital. We're not true equipment lenders. We would do it under a senior lien. We may tag it to advances against equipment, which could give you a little more than just a pure general corporate purpose facility. But we're not in the business of doing specific lien finance, which there are many equipment lenders out there or lessors. And so many companies access those paths for sort of the early stage, for the pilot lines, for the demo lines. There's some good equipment financiers out there. You can have a venture debt facility alongside, equipment leasing or equipment finance. There's always the ability to carve that out. So we see those two work hand in hand. Sometimes we do it all ourselves. It just depends on the situation. As your company is growing and expanding, and you've gotten to market and you want to grow more, certainly you can access debt to buy more equipment, for example, or to bring on more FTE for sales and marketing. And companies generally use some combination of debt and equity to do that. As I said, our later stage sort of structured commercial covenanted term debt is one that we access for that. The mezz debt is also very useful for market expansion. Again, maybe to talk about plant finance, it's something that we can do. We can provide some incremental debt into a pilot line, for example. The goal, I think, of most companies is to finance 70 or 80% of that with debt. And certainly once you're generating, positive cash flows or consistent cash flows, you have the ability to do that. Then it starts looking more like project finance. But in the earlier stages, there's just uncertainty as far as who your offtake is going to be, whether you're going to be able to sell, the production of this early commercial plant or this pilot plant. Even in a pilot plant, even if you sell some of your revenue, it's still not it's not a validation in the market as necessarily for accessing big amounts of plant finance. So often companies are going to need to use equity for the pilot in the early commercial phase. It's a little frustrating. Nate and I have talked about this to some extent, and we have a lot of internal discussions about to further help companies that are in this position, because it's a bit of a conundrum. We can finance up to maybe 25 or 30% of a pilot plant at Silicon Valley Bank. Again, looking at the specific equipment. So we do have the ability to finance some of it, but that still leaves a pretty big nut if you need to put, say $20 million into a plant. If you're only able to get 5 or 6 at bank, you still have to come up with 15. Equipment lenders, again, can do some of that, but there's soft costs, there's T&I, there are other things outside of equipment that go into plant finance. And so equity still is the main source of capital for that. And often that comes from a big strategic partner, right? And so one of the good reasons to kind of pull together a syndicate that includes a strategic partner, in your B or C round. And most companies know to do that. I guess the last thing I wanted to talk on the why debt is bridge finance. We get a lot of questions around bridge finance, and that's where companies have raised an A round, for example, and are getting close to their B, but they're getting short on funds, and they want to raise it. They come to the bank and say, "Look, we're about to raise our B. Can you just give us a little bit of money to get there?" And the problem is, short of an executed term sheet or a convertible note that you just don't want to access, it's very hard for a bank to provide bridge finance, because there's just, if that round doesn't come through, we're sort of left holding the bag without a secondary source of repayment. So I would say that on rare occasions we can do bridge finance, but not very often. Just to move along a little bit here, and this is pretty much the last slide. How to unlock debt. So as I said before, for earlier stage cash burning companies, what's really key is your investor syndicate. So the way that the Silicon Valley Bank, has been able to lend money over time is we develop relationships with these VC firms, and they understand our expectations, in particular, that if they put money in and come into a company and come to us requesting debt for that company, that they're going to be a backstop and one, assure us that they plan to participate in the B round, for example, which would be our repayment source, or the C round, or just have the funds available, the capacity and willingness to support the company if, say, they're at revenue and they just, things go sideways for a while and the company doesn't generate cash flow as early as they expect. We need the investors to be there to assure us that they're going to put additional money in to support the company and ultimately get us repaid. For alternative protein companies, and clean tech in general, the traditional VC Sand Hill Road types have not jumped in with 2 feet, but a little bit more, as certainly as a couple of these outcomes are showing that this is an attractive space to be. But we find that a syndicate can include, family offices. It can include corporate VCs that are coming in a lot earlier these days. It can include, frankly, private equity firms are coming in with, they're carving out a piece of their portfolio of a particular fund for venture investing. So we're seeing private equity firms, we're seeing sovereign wealth funds, of course. They tend to come in a little bit later and write the bigger checks. What's hard for us, and all of those we can lend around as long as there is at least one core VC that we know, or one family office that we have a history with, so that we can feel assured that someone's going to step up and help us and help the company, and not just walk away and leave us holding the keys. Access to capital is the key to early stage venture lending. Management team is also very important. We talked about it a little bit earlier. We love to see folks that have done this type of work previously and know how venture debt works, and know how to bring a company to market. Unfortunately, there's just hasn't been a lot of examples of that in the alternative protein space as of yet. But the reality is, our friends, neither of our friends at Impossible or Beyond Meat came with any entrepreneurial background. They were basically scientists and technologists, and those companies are doing quite well. So as long as you surround yourself with good people, that's going to be very helpful. And in my mind, and I think in most banks' mind, financial record keeping is paramount. Um, Paramount to really giving us confidence in the company, because we rely a lot on the projections, right? If you want to take on debt, you're going to have to give us some idea of where you think the company will be going over the next 18 to 24 months. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be reasonable. We often find that companies will come and give us, particularly as they're sort of getting close to revenue, they'll give us these very aggressive stretch goal projections, and they're going to go from 0 to 20 million in a year, and that's fine. Some companies can do that, but if you give us that and we underwrite to that, and you only do 5, that's going to be a problem. And so I really want to emphasize, one, the quality of the financial information that you keep and give to a bank is really important. And 2, that you're very thoughtful about the projections that you give a bank. And while you don't want to sell yourself short, it's pleasing to the bank to have the companies they work with exceed their goals rather than fall short. We don't take a big offense to companies that don't quite make their goals, but if you're way off, it's a yellow flag if you want to come back and get more lending. We need to have confidence in your ability to kind of see where the business is going, even though there's a lot of unknowns. The technology, we want to be differentiated and defendable, right? So if you're just doing another commodity, it's going to be tough for us to lend to that. So if you have IP, if there's particular things about your company that are going to prevent high barriers to entry, that's going to be more preferable to us. It's a little hard in the food space, but I think there are ways that you are able to do that. Addressable market, of course, we want to see the company opportunity to really grow quickly. Again, those are the companies that we're interested in. Those are the companies that the VCs are interested in. Not that a slow growing company that grows organically, that's a perfectly legitimate and great thing to do. It's just one that's going to be hard to access debt from a provider like Silicon Valley Bank. Once you're cash flow positive, any bank is going to be interested in, and you can go shop around and find the best deal. But for pre-revenue, pre-cash flow positive companies, you kind of got to do what we want to see, which is have some good support and be able to try to grow the company relatively quickly. Part of that is just understanding and articulating a relatively clear pathway to commercialization, right? So if you got a really cool technology, you got to figure out how you can sell it. In the alternative protein space, I don't think that's difficult, right? That's easy to sort of show that. So that's one that you can check that box probably pretty easily. And then finally, as you grow, again, in order to access meaningful capital from a venture provider such as Silicon Valley Bank, we really are going to want to see the revenue ramp fairly quickly, and certainly we want to see margins grow over time. Our companies in this space are operating at negative margins for a reasonable amount of time, gross margins, as they kind of get to market, and that can be for a year or two. But after that, we want to start to kind of see the positive margins and see the margin growth, because if you get hung up and aren't able to sort of increase your margins, it's going to be tough to access capital after that point. Rushed a little bit through that part of it, but wanted to get to questions because I think there's probably some out there that are more specific and happy to answer. So thanks again for your time on this. I hope it was somewhat interesting and helpful. And with that, Nate, happy to answer some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jordan. That was super informative, and I learned a lot. So thank you. And yeah, we have about 15 minutes for questions. So please do go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and I will ask them. We already have a couple of good questions from investors, but I will just quickly sneak one in before we hit those. And would love for you to spend a couple of minutes on a hypothetical. So say, you brought this up earlier, some scientist, entrepreneur has figured out a way to create pea protein via a fermentation process, which is somehow cheaper than what you could grow in a field. So let's just fiat that point and assume they've done this, and you've proven yourself at bench scale, and you want to build a pilot facility, and you also want to start, selling your consumer product that you've built as well. Like, what does it look like for them? And they've just raised a Series A, but they maybe didn't get a lot of debt along the way. So like, what's their first step to work with you or any other lender? Like, do they work through their investor or what?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. So often they do. You would talk to the board and the investors and see if they have any relationships with banks. We get a lot of referrals from the investors that say, "Hey, we just put money into company A. It's really exciting. We love this company," because that's what we want to hear, right? We want to hear the investor enthusiasm, and they'll refer something over, and then we'll have that discussion. So that's certainly a key way. I think the other thing is, you tend to want to engage with the banks early on. Like I said, we try to get companies at formation and even at seed round funding, because the earlier that you can establish a relationship with Silicon Valley Bank, for example, the more, we start to get to know you, we start to understand what you're doing, and even through the technology development phase, if we can see that you're sort of hitting your goals from the technology side, that's going to give us more confidence once you come to us and say, okay, let's start talking about debt, because it's about execution, really. And while we don't expect perfection, I think that's a good point too. So through the accelerators and the incubators, we have relationships with a lot of them as well. Not only us, there's other banks that do.
So practically, what does that look like? I mean, do the banks have contact forms on their website, or do you just, should people apply or just email a banker? What do they do?
Yeah, so we've got a contact us form on the website, and so I'm not sure what the front end looks like, but we definitely do get referrals in through the website. This group is certainly welcome to contact me directly. Yeah, sometimes I guess it's hard if you don't have a contact at the bank to engage with them. But I think most banks are try to make it accommodating to come in through their website.
Okay, and so last question of mine. Sorry, you had stressed the importance of investor relationships. You having a history with an investor. In this industry, a lot of the real leading investors are mission-driven investors that have formed specifically for this industry. So how can they, without a lot of history, build the great relationships with banks like yours?
Yeah, so happy to engage with investors and like-minded investors at any point, and I do that fairly frequently. And there's certainly, there's been a lot of interesting, new formations, and the mission-driven piece is huge and super important. That's really going to drive the space and really the type of businesses that I want to lend to over time. So happy to engage with investors now and at any point as far as what they're thinking about, what they're looking about, and how we might be able to work together. Because while some of the Sand Hill Road type VCs are coming back in the space, not in a big way, and it's really the mission, the impact investors that we want to align with anyway because of the good overlap.
Yeah, awesome, thank you. So first audience question is from Jay Karandikar at New Crop Capital, and he's asking if you've modified your standard terms for venture debt since the pandemic began, and maybe like add on to that, just like what has changed in your world as relevant to alt proteins since COVID.
Yeah, so COVID was very interesting, or well, interesting is a pretty euphemistic. It was a pretty good challenge out the gate, and we spent some amount of time really focusing inward and looking at our portfolio, making sure we had our arms around our existing portfolio. But at the same time, we continue to look at new opportunities, and we do. And it's been surprisingly robust generally, and specifically in the alt protein space, it's been as busy as ever. In fact, I'm
Wow.
busier than I've ever been. How do we look at debt differently? The hurdle's a little bit higher, in all honesty, but it's also very competitive. So the hurdle being that it's hard to go in and provide debt to a company that has, I mean, you know this already, Jake, I'm sure that, if they have 3 or 4 months of runway, it's, the bank's not going to be able to step in and do much. But if they've recently raised a round, and I know you guys are in a couple of the companies that we're working with right now, then, as long as there's a reasonable amount of runway, I don't think the calculus has really changed that much. And in fact, given that there's so much excitement in the space, it's as competitive as ever.
Yeah, great. And so, yeah, we've got a couple of questions about your thoughts on specific types of debt, and then a question on reasons not to take debt. So we should be able to get through all those before we run out of time here. So the first question is, what are your thoughts on variable debt, like revenue share or royalty payments?
Well, my thoughts are we don't do that. And it is an interesting space. I can't say I know a tremendous amount about it. I think there could be some benefit to that. I mean, we see that more broadly in society, right, as well. I wouldn't be able to give you an educated response to that other than, it's worth considering all options. The problem I think with that, again, is on the upside, right? If you start to do really well, then, a fairly big amount of that's going to go to a third party, and it's going to ultimately be pretty expensive.
Yeah.
If you can sort of temper maybe the tenor of that debt, it may be more advantageous, but I think it's certainly worth considering. Yeah.
Okay. So, and then Michael O'Brien is asking for a little bit more on working capital finance, specifically, how do you decide on purchase order and receivables financing? I guess that means from your end, like, how do you decide whether you're going to grant something like that?
Yeah. So, for working capital, AR finance is sort of the bread and butter of it, right? If you've shipped product and you've got a receivable from a strong counterparty, that's pretty easy to finance overall. The caveat being for cash burning companies, you still have to have some cushion on the balance sheet. So even if you come to us and have great AR, if you've got a month or two of cash, it's going to be hard for us to structure around that. There are others that do it. There are true AR lenders that maybe can get a little more aggressive, maybe probably not though to pre-cash flow positive companies. They're factors, right? Factors are a good alternative in that case. But AR lending is something we do a lot. When you start to get towards inventory lending and then to purchase order finance, you're going a little farther out the risk curve, right? Because in order to convert from inventory to a PO and convert from a PO to actual AR, there's steps in between, and there's opportunity to to fall off from there. So we tend to do that sort of financing for companies that we've got a little bit of a track record with, or that have been in the market and have been selling and have good AR. But also they do need a little bit of more cushion on the balance sheet, right? We need to make sure that the company, in our worst case scenario, we need to make sure the company is around long enough to fulfill that PO, right? So that could be 3 to 6 months of cash. So it's a little harder than AR finance, and we tend to do it incremental to AR finance. So as part of a broader facility, it'll be a piece of that. So it's hard to come to us or a bank and say, look, I want to do only inventory finance or only PO finance. It can be a little tough. If you got a ton of cash, we can be very flexible. As cash dwindles, the flexibility tends to get tighter.
Well, great. Maybe like 1 to 2 minutes on our last main question here, and that is reasons not to take debt finance, maybe particularly venture debt finance. Like, what are the risks to a company of doing that?
the risk isn't as much about not taking it because it's good non-dilutive capital. And if you're able to get it, it means you're doing some things right? Because there's plenty of companies that would love to get venture debt and aren't able to qualify because for whatever reason, don't have a good investor set or don't have a good plan, don't have good clear financial pathway to commercialization. My caveat is be careful about how much debt you take because companies tend to think, well, not tend to think, but some come out and say, look, we want to leverage as much as possible. Our board is pressing us to take on as much debt as possible. The problem is if you take on $5-10 million of debt, for a Series A or B company, it's hard to take that much for an A company, but a B round company, and then you need to raise more money at a C, and maybe all of a sudden you're at 10 or 25 million of debt, and you go out to equity investors and say, I want to raise 75 million. They're going to say, well, how much of that is going to go towards repaying debt versus, going to actually grow the business. And so we definitely see examples where companies take on too much debt and then they have problems later on trying to raise additional capital, either refinancing that debt or bringing in more equity. So I would just be careful and prudent about the amount of debt you take. But if you can get it, I definitely, I think, putting debt on your capital stack generally is a good thing.
Great. Well, we are out of time here, and I guess just thank you so much, Jordan. That was incredibly helpful, and we'll be sharing the recording with everyone, and I might watch it again. And just briefly, how can folks get a hold of you? We have people from all across the world. So say if you're in Europe, even, should they reach out to you directly through your contact page, or should they reach out to their local branch? How do we get in touch?
Sure. You can reach out to me directly, is great, through LinkedIn, or my email is jkanis, Kanis @svb.com. We don't really, the offices that we have overseas aren't really branches per se. They're not really, you can't really walk in, but if you have contacts or through the website, you can probably access there as well. But I'm happy to be a conduit back to them. So for the international folks, if you want to contact me, I can help put you in touch with the right people overseas, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jordan, for being a tremendous asset for our industry. And I think many of us look forward to working with you in the future. And everyone, thank you for joining. We'll see you next month for kind of a natural follow-up to this with Arco Murray, which is a design build firm. And we'll talk about things like facility design, retrofitting, equipment integration, food safety issues, site choosing your site, and then more on plant finance. So a good natural follow-up to that. And we'll see you August 14th for that. And you can find more information at gfi.org/community. All right, gotta hop off here now. Yeah, thank you, Jordan. Thanks, everyone.